I want to talk to you today about a couple of problems in Kant's ethics, and in particular a passage near the end of the second section of the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals that sheds important light, I think, on both of these puzzles, helps us understand what Kant is thinking about two fundamental issues. One is the question of a good will. What is a good will? It is the foundation of Kant's ethics. And yet he tells us very little, in a sense, about how he gets to his conclusions about what a good will is. I think we can gain some important insights, though they don't emerge until near the end of the second section. And the other issue has to do with the formulations of the categorical imperative. In his view, how many formulations are there? I think the answer emerges there pretty clearly. There are 3 in his view. Some scholars think there are as many as 5, but Kant, I think, views there as being 3. One of them is simply an elucidation of the first one, and another I think he thinks of as not really its own independent formulation of the categorical imperative at all. But again, how these relate to each other is summarized near the end of the second section. It's elaborated in great detail in arguments taking us from one to the other, but it's not until the end that we really see very clearly what the core of the argument is. So that's what I want to focus on today. What is a good will? How does Kant really think of himself as answering that question? And also, how do the various formulations of the categorical imperative, all of which he claims are equivalent, how do they really relate to each other? Let's start with the question of a good will. What exactly is a good will? The first sentence of the first section of the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals is this: nothing can possibly be conceived in the world or even out of it which can be called good without qualification, except a good will. Now, I've talked elsewhere about exactly what I think he means by this. That is to say, by claiming that it is the only thing that is good without qualification. But today I want to focus on a different question. What exactly is a good will? How do we know what a good will is? And in particular, why does he come to the conclusions he does about it, which are far from intuitive? For years, I've been asking groups of students, okay, intuitively speaking, what is a good will? What is a person of good will, for example? And they give a variety of answers that I think are quite natural and quite intuitive. They say things like, well, such a person is kind, they're well-meaning, they're caring, they're helpful, they desire the best for everyone. And all of those things are pretty plausible interpretations of what it is to have a good will. Now, today I want to try to understand Kant's answer. And Kant's answer is at least not directly that at all. In fact, it's quite surprising. It connects to his questions about universality, about not making an exception for yourself, but instead acting on principle. And yes, I think we could agree that perhaps a person of goodwill does act on the basis of principle, but it's not the first thing that comes to anybody's mind. So how does he get there? Here is what Kant actually says about this. The preeminent good, which we call moral, can therefore consist in nothing else than the conception of law in itself. He goes on to say, as I have deprived the will of every impulse which could arise to it from obedience to any law, there remains nothing but the universal conformity of its actions to law in general, which alone is to serve the will as a principle. That is, I am never to act otherwise than so that I could also will that my maxim should become a universal law. So that's his idea of a good will. A good will is, well, a will that acts in accordance with the categorical imperative, act only on that maxim you can at the same time will as a universal law. What makes a will good is nothing but the conformity to law in itself, and law here is understood as essentially universal, so it's simply a matter of conformity to universal law. Or intuitively speaking, acting on principle, acting on the basis of universal principles. Now again, that's a rather surprising conclusion. If I say to people, intuitively speaking, what's a person of good will, they don't say one that acts only on those maxims you can at the same time will as a universal law. So it's a rather startling conclusion that he derives, and he doesn't really explain much about how he gets there. So that's our first puzzle. The second puzzle is that he tells us there can be one and only one categorical imperative, And that makes sense. After all, he thinks there is one and only one thing that is good without qualification, good no matter what, namely a good will. So what can a categorical imperative be? A categorical imperative is one that applies to every possible situation, in other words, that applies no matter what. And so it naturally goes along with this idea of, well, it connects to a good that is good no matter what, namely a good will. So in effect, all of the categorical imperative formulations are formulations of a basic idea, which is have a good will. But he gives us then several different formulations, and he claims they're all equivalent. But they don't sound very clearly equivalent at all. Consider the first one, sometimes called the formula of universal law. I've already mentioned what it is. Act only on that maxim you can at the same time will as a universal law. The second is the formula of humanity, which says treat humanity as an end in itself, never as a means only. That is humanity in yourself and humanity in other people. Now that's a slightly strange formulation, talking about humanity rather than, for example, all rational beings, which really is what this book is about. But let's leave that aside for the moment and just focus on the question of what it really means in practice. It means I have to treat myself as an end in myself, not as a mere means. I have to treat you as an end in yourself, not merely as a means. So not only can I not make exceptions for myself, I can't treat you or myself with disrespect. I have to respect your dignity and autonomy as a rational agent equal to me. The third formulation is the formula of the kingdom of ends, and it goes like this: act as a legislator, making universal laws for a kingdom of ends. A kingdom of ends is a situation where there is a systematic unity of ends, he says, where everyone treats everyone else as an end in him or herself, not merely as a means. Now these, he says, are three modes of one law, but at first glance they don't seem like one law at all. After all, act in conformity with universal law, treat everyone with respect as an end in themselves rather than as a means only, and finally act as if you were a legislator in a kingdom of ends. Those don't sound like the same idea. And so let's think about how he sees their relation. As I say, it really doesn't become very clear for a long time in the groundwork until we get to pretty much the end of the second section, where he finally lays out his vision of how this work fits together. The three modes of presenting the principle of morality that have been adduced are at bottom only so many formulae of the very same law, and each of itself involves the other two. There is, however, a difference in them, but it's rather subjectively than objectively practical, intended, namely, to bring an idea of the reason nearer to intuition by means of a certain analogy, and thereby nearer to feeling. So these are three formulations of the very same law. I've expressed that basic underlying idea as have a good will. Here, he is elaborating that according to his understanding of what a good will is, namely one that treats people with respect and acts according to universal law. And he thinks of those as really coming down to the same thing. So let's see how the argument goes. He begins by talking about maxims, and he says all maxims in fact have a form consisting in universality. And in this view, the formula of the moral imperative is expressed thus, that the maxims must be so chosen as if they were to serve as universal laws of nature. This is, in short, the idea of the formula of universal law. Act only on that maxim you can at the same time will as universal law, or as a universal law of nature. So the formula of universal law gives us the form of that underlying idea. But he says, not only does every maxim have a form, it has a matter. And the matter gives us the second formulation, the formula of humanity. He says, every maxim has a matter, namely an end, and here the formula says that the rational being, as it is an end by its own nature and thereby an end in itself, must in every maxim serve as the condition, limiting all merely relative and arbitrary ends. So this is how we end up with the formula of humanity. It's this underlying idea in material as opposed to formal mode, and it says treat humanity in yourself or in another, always as an end and never as a means only. So maxims have a form and a matter, but they also, he says, have a complete characterization. Now, what's a complete characterization? Anybody in the Aristotelian tradition, broadly, is used to thinking in terms of form and matter, but what does he mean by a complete characterization? He explains it this way. There is a complete characterization of all maxims by means of that formula, namely that all maxims ought by their very own legislation to harmonize with a possible kingdom of ends as with a kingdom of nature. This is what gives us the formula of the kingdom of ends. A rational being must always regard himself as giving laws either as a member or as a sovereign in the kingdom of ends. Now, there's several things that are important about this. In talking about a complete characterization, he has in mind that our maxims must make sense together. We don't, in other words, evaluate the maxims according to which we act just one by one. We have to think, okay, this maxim has a form and it has a matter and it fits into a system of maxims. I have a way of living that doesn't just address this situation, but addresses a variety of situations. So I come equipped with a variety of maxims. They all have to be compossible. They have to be things that can make sense together as a body of universal laws for a kingdom of ends. That is to say, for a body of people, all of whom treat others in the group as ends in themselves and not merely as means. Now, Kant thinks of this in part in terms of categories that he elaborated in the Critique of Pure Reason. He says, there is a progress here in the order of the categories from unity of the form of the will, its universality, plurality of the matter, the objects, the ends, and totality of the system of these. In forming our moral judgments of actions, it's better to proceed always on the strict method and start from the general formula of the categorical imperative, act according to a maxim which can at the same time make itself a universal law. That is the unity of the form of the will. That expresses the universality. But we can also think in terms of a multiplicity, a plurality, namely everybody who counts as a moral agent, a rational agent, and therefore has to be treated with respect as an end rather than merely as a means. And finally, we can think in terms of that complete characterization. That is to say, the plurality considered as a totality. The plurality not only of individual people in the kingdom of ends, but also the plurality of maxims, as making sense as universal laws for such a kingdom. He also tells us in that passage why he's doing this, why he moves from the unity and the formal idea to the more material and plurality idea of the formula of humanity. He tells us that if we wish to gain an entrance for the moral law, it's very useful to bring one and the same action under the three specified conceptions, and thereby, as far as possible, to bring it nearer to intuition. In other words, if I say, hey, a good will is one that conforms to universal law as such, conformity to law as such is its rule, you're going to say, what? That's a weird idea. That's a weird conception of a good will. But if I tell you it's one that treats other people with respect, one that expresses a concern for other people as rational agents and respects their autonomy as rational agents, then you say, okay, I see what it is. You're saying it's kind of like the golden rule. Treat others as you would want to be treated. In other words, respect their rationality the way you expect them to respect your rationality. That makes sense. That is a much more intuitive idea. So in effect, he's saying, look, I'm giving you a core formulation that is the formal idea, and it's the one that I take most seriously as the foundation for moral thinking, namely acting on the basis of principle, on the basis of universal law. But I recognize that's not very intuitive, and it's not easy to judge maxims by that. Let's bring it a little closer to intuition. What do you normally mean by a good will? I bet you mean something like treating other people with the kind of respect you expect them to use for yourself. Treat other people with the kind of attitude that you have toward yourself and you want them to have toward you, respecting your rational judgment. So in bringing it closer to intuition, we're thinking not just in a formal sense, does this comply with conformity to universal law as such? That's pretty hard to evaluate. Instead, we're thinking, does this treat people with respect? Does it respect their autonomy? Does it respect their dignity as moral agents? Am I treating myself with that level of dignity? Am I treating others with that level of dignity? It's not quite care in an emotional sense, but it is a kind of fundamental respect that Kant says is really critical. I care about my friends, I care about those I love, I don't have an obligation to care about other people in the same way that I care about my loved ones and my friends, but I do have an obligation to respect them as fellow rational agents, capable of making their own decisions. Now, Kant says, we can go back to the beginning. We can go back and reflect on how exactly these various formulations relate to each other and how they shed light on the concept of a good will. He says we can now end where we started at the beginning, namely with the conception of a will unconditionally good. That will is absolutely good which cannot be evil. In other words, whose maxim, if made a universal law, could never contradict itself. So cannot be evil, he's saying that's a matter of not being able to contradict yourself. And there are two claims here. One claim is that consistency is a necessary condition for a good will. The other is that consistency is a sufficient condition for a good will. The first is pretty plausible. Hey, look, to really exhibit a good will, you gotta be consistent. You can't just be off again and on again about morality and about treating people with respect and following the rules or principles. Yeah, that seems like a plausible, defensible idea. But now that that's enough, hey, consistency is all you need. That's much more surprising. So how does he justify that? Does he justify it at all? He tells us first that consistency entails universality. This principle then is the supreme law. Act always on such a maxim as thou canst at the same time will to be a universal law. In other words, the formula of universal law. This is the sole condition under which a will can never contradict itself, and such an imperative is categorical. Since the validity of the will as a universal law for possible actions is analogous to the universal connection of the existence of things by general laws, which is the formal notion of nature in general, the categorical imperative can also be expressed thus: act on maxims which can at the same time have for their object themselves as universal laws of nature. Such then is the formula of an absolutely good will. But is it only a necessary condition? That view would be pretty plausible, and it would lead us to the idea that Kant is really identifying here an a priori core of morality, a categorical imperative that must be obeyed by any rational agent. But it wouldn't be enough necessarily to fill in all of morality. We might say, look, all moral agents, all rational agents deserve this kind of respect. But then maybe there are other parts of morality that are a posteriori, that depend on human nature itself. For example, anything related to happiness. He says, we can't take for granted that any rational agent cares about its own happiness or about the happiness of others, but human beings seem to. And so there is, you might say, a part of ethics, if you wanted, that goes above and beyond the a priori core that he identifies and talks about human happiness and how we behave in such a way as to make ourselves or other people happy. Now that is not Kant's view, but it is a possible view here. We could pause and say, yes, consistency is a necessary condition for having a good will, but it's not itself enough. We need a caring, a concern for other people. We need prudence with respect to our own happiness and a concern for the happiness of others. Kant thinks, however, that we really have here not just a necessary condition, but a necessary and sufficient condition for morality. Why not say that this a priori core is part of morality, but not by any means the whole of morality, at least for human beings? He says here's the difficulty. That a priori part may very frequently come into conflict with the a posteriori part. That is to say, look, a concern for happiness, whether our own happiness or the happiness of others, he says, that's not compatible with the core of morality that I've identified. It actually frequently conflicts with it. We can often make ourselves happy by using other people, by violating the rules, making exceptions for ourselves, and maybe we can even on balance make other people happy that way too. And so a utilitarian is going to say, yeah, there can be exceptions to all these moral rules. Sometimes it's worth treating somebody with disrespect. Sometimes it's worth giving up a bit of your own dignity. And Kant says, yeah, those conflicts are going to happen all the time. So actually we can't just say, yes, you've got this happy a priori core, that's necessary, it's categorical, but now we have this additional part. If you want to be happy and you want other people to be happy, you also have to obey these rules. Kant says, that's going to lead us into trouble from the get-go. It's not going to work. So what can we do? Kant operates, I think, with something like this model of decision-making. Think of a moral agent. That moral agent is shaped by her own character, by prior commitments, by desires, by a variety of constraints, some of them moral constraints, legal constraints, social constraints, and is facing a situation where there are certain options that are available, and that agent is going to have, as a rational agent, certain goals. Now, the agent, in facing this situation and deciding what to do, has to formulate some kind of maxim. After all, insofar as an agent is rational, that agent chooses for reasons. And a maxim here really functions as a reason, functions in most contemporary moral theories. So a rational agent decides on the basis of reasons. Let's look at the reasons. Are those legitimate reasons for action? That's really the heart of Kant's ethics. And so Kant is saying, well, let's look at the reasons. We have to evaluate them in light of the options available, and on the basis of that, we're going to formulate some kind of intention to act. Then the agent is going to act in a certain way. The act will have certain effects. And then we may be able to evaluate things on the basis of the goals we had, the effects we wanted, and then the effects we actually obtained, and repeat the whole process again and again and again throughout our lives. But if that's the model of decision-making, what does that imply about what he's told us about this a priori core of morality? He says, among the goals that any rational agent has is the furtherance of that agent's own rationality. In other words, I as a rational agent inherently am going to value my own rationality. What is my own rationality? It involves reasoning about how to attain my ends, what means are appropriate to attaining those ends. And so, in short, my rational nature is vital to me being able to actually attain my ends and get what I want. Well, that means I'm going to value not only those things that I want, but also my ability to use appropriate means to get what I want. That means I'm going to value my own talents, my own abilities. It means I'm going to value my own rational nature, my ability to think things through well enough to choose the right means to obtain my ends. So all rational beings, qua rational, value their own rationality. That is a crucial step. He tells us, rational nature is distinguished from the rest of nature by this, that it sets before itself an end. This end would be the matter of every good will. But since in the idea of a will that is absolutely good without being limited by any condition of attaining this or that end, we must abstract wholly from every end to be affected, since this would make every will only relatively good. It follows that in this case the end must be conceived not as an end to be affected, but as an independently existing end. So in other words, if we're to think what is it that is good without qualification, we have to think what is good independently of any end achieved. After all, whether an end is achieved or not depends on all sorts of things. And so inevitably any directive we have, any maxim, any reason that's involved with some such external effect, that's something that is going to require, well, hypothetical judgments. That will be true in certain kinds of situations, one where that effect actually obtains, and won't apply very well in situations where that end won't obtain or where that end is undesirable for other reasons. So in short, the only end we can really focus on and have as a categorical imperative, the only end, in other words, that can really issue in something that is good without qualification, is something that is inherent in the nature of rational nature itself. And that is rationality itself. There is one and only one thing that every rational nature always values, namely rational nature, its own rationality. On that basis, we can actually formulate some idea that is going to express what is good without qualification, and some directive, some maxim, some formula that will tell us this is something that applies categorically, no matter what, to all possible situations. Consequently, Kant says, the independently existing end, rational nature itself, is conceived only negatively as that which we must never act against, and which therefore must never be regarded merely as a means, but must in every volition be esteemed as an end likewise. Now this end can be nothing but the subject of all possible ends, since this is also the subject of a possible absolutely good will. for such a will cannot without contradiction be postponed to any other object. So we get a basic formula here: never act against rational nature. So no matter what, we are to act only on that maxim: you can at the same time will is universal law. No matter what, all rational beings, qua rational, value their own rationality, and so it's going to follow that we get the formula of humanity. You may not treat a rational agent merely as a means to your own ends. Why? Well, suppose you could. Suppose you could treat a rational agent merely as a means to your ends, then you would value your own rationality more than you value theirs. You cannot will the maxim value your own rationality above that of others universally. That clearly leads to contradiction. You're going to be saying, I'm going to value mine more than yours, you better value yours more than mine. Conflict inevitably results. So I can't maintain all of those things at the same time. Consequently, I get the conclusion you may not treat a rational agent merely as a means to your own ends. But now what about the other direction? Can we go from the formula of humanity to the formula of universal law? That might seem a bit more surprising. Here's how Kant tries to do it. He says, no matter what, treat humanity as an end in itself, never merely as a means. And remember that no matter what, all rational beings qua rational value their own rationality. Well now, suppose a rational agent can't consistently will a maxim as a universal law. What does that mean? Well, the maxim has to contradict rational nature itself. It might contradict itself, but it might also contradict rational nature. That maxim must contradict the value, then, of some possible rational agent's rationality. And that means that maxim doesn't treat some possible rational agent as an end, but merely as a means. So we derive as our conclusion that no matter what, act only on that maxim you can at the same time will as a universal law. The result of that reasoning is that we now have an equivalence between the formula of universal law and the formula of humanity. But what about that third formulation he discusses, the formula of the kingdom of ends? How does it fit into the picture? It follows incontestably, Kant says, that to whatever laws any rational being may be subject, he being an end in himself must be able to regard himself also as legislating universally in respect of these same laws, since it is just this fitness of his maxims for universal legislation that distinguishes him as an end in himself. It also follows that this implies his dignity, his prerogative, above all merely physical beings, that he must always take his maxims from the point of view which regards himself and likewise every other rational being as law-giving beings, on which account they are called persons. So the formula of universal law, together with the formula of humanity, do entail, he says, the formula of the kingdom of ends. No matter what, all rational beings are ends in themselves and must act only on universal maxims. This fitness of his maxims for universal legislation distinguishes rational agents as ends in themselves. It also gives them dignity. No matter what, then, all rational agents must always act only on maxims consistent with regarding all rational beings as law-giving. And so, no matter what, every rational being must act as a legislating member in the universal kingdom of ends. So Kant is now drawing to a close, giving us an indication of how all these various pieces fit together. He says, in this way, a world of rational beings, a mundus intelligibilis, that is to say, an intelligible world, is possible as a kingdom of ends, and this by virtue of the legislation proper to all persons as members. Therefore, every rational being must so act, as if he were by his maxims in every case a legislating member in the universal kingdom of ends. The formal principle of these maxims is, so act as if thy maxim were to serve likewise as the universal law of all rational beings. So I think here is the map of how the whole groundwork fits together. We have the formula of universal law giving us the form of this underlying idea that we have to act in accordance with the one thing that is good without qualification, the one thing that is good no matter what, namely having a good will. And that turns out to be, by the end, equivalent to this idea that we act in conformity with universal law. That turns out to be equivalent to saying that we have to treat everyone, including ourselves, with respect. That is to say, we have to treat everyone as an end, not merely as a means. And from those two together, we can deduce the formula of the kingdom of ends, that we have to act as legislating members in a universal kingdom of ends, as if we are giving laws to a kingdom where everybody else views him or herself as a legislator, similarly giving universal laws. That in turn, of course, implies that the maxims have to conform to universal law, and so we get right back to the formula of universal law. Consequently, these three, he thinks, are equivalent. They are indeed formulations of one underlying idea, namely, have a good will. Act in accordance with the one and only one thing, he thinks, that is good without qualification, a good will.